Good evening, everybody. We are here tonight with the next presentation in the GOSA presentation series for 2024 with Demetri Stoumbos for When to Walk Away, taking a look at a new look into old data. And with that, we will give it to Demetri.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If we haven't met before, my name is Demetri Stoumbos. Today, we're going to be looking at when to walk away, a new look into old data. Now, we could fill up an entire lecture about the philosophy of time management in gazing and its relationship to the sunken cost fallacy. Thanks, Ben Viel, for planting that seed in my head. But that's not today. Today we'll be taking a more analytical approach, looking at the data, and see if we can tease out any trends about what happens to geysers as they reach later in their interval. So a little bit of an overview to today's seminar. I'm going to give a little bit of background to the concept of how we can look at geyser activity later in the interval, a little bit of a quick review of traditional geyser statistics, go through this kind of new method of crunching the numbers, talk about some constraints and limitations to the statistics, and explore the data, see what we can get from the geysers and from the wealth of data we have on them historically. First off, a little bit about myself. I first visited Yellowstone in 2006 and then begged and begged my parents to take me back the next year, and I've been gazing ever since. I worked 4 summers at the upper store at the fountain. I currently live in Bozeman, so just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the park. So you'll often see me on weekends in the park volunteering in the Upper Geyser Basin. And I have spent entirely too much time waiting for this sucker to erupt. This is Orem Geyser. It is part of the Geyser Hill group. And if any of you have waited for Orem in the past, you'll know what it's like. You sit and it splashes and it splashes and it splashes and it splashes. And then it surges some water and you get excited and then it splashes and it splashes and so on and so forth. Well, through the hundreds of hours that I've spent watching this, I've had a lot of time to think about the eruption mechanics of geysers of Orem, and it led me to one question. As I'm sitting there and waiting, are my chances of seeing it going up or down? Well, I went to all the eruptive history we have of Orem to see if I could answer that. Now, usually when we look at geyser statistics, we can look at all the data we have of known intervals of the geyser. That is, the time from the beginning of one eruption to the beginning of the next eruption. So for this geyser here, which I will not disclose quite yet, we can look at the stats and see an average interval. Okay, this one has an average of 19.2 hours between eruptions, or a range of between 8.3 hours to 47.3 hours. If you want to get more into the nitty gritty, you can also look at the mode or first and third quartiles. But one of the most tried and true ways to visualize this data is with an interval histogram, like this here. So here, what we'll have is on the x-axis, we'll have the intervals. And on the y-axis, we'll have how many times in the data set we see this interval popped up. So for this geyser, we can see that not many eruptions happen between 9 and 10 hours. A lot of eruptions happen between 15 and 16 hours, 16 and 17, all the way out to 21 and 22 hours. But after that, we're not getting that many eruptions. So again, I ask the question, once you get to around 22 hours, does that mean your chances are going down? It's really hard to say just by looking at this histogram. And in fact, I'll show you 3 histograms for geysers side by side, and I'll ask you this question. Which of these geysers gets more likely the longer you wait? Which of these geysers reaches a steady state? And which of these geysers actually becomes less likely to erupt as time goes on? Have any guesses? Well, let's take this first histogram, for example. This is actually from Artemisia Geyser from a time period between 2005 and 2021. And so conceptually, we want to ask ourselves, okay, given that it hasn't erupted yet, how likely is it to erupt in the next hour? Or let's put it in other words, how many of the eruptions with an interval greater than X, or how long it's been since the last eruption, are going to happen within the following hour? For example, let's take this time point, 22 hours. So it's been 22 hours since the last Artemisia eruption. We know that we can ignore all the data about intervals that are shorter than 22 hours. Instead, we're going to focus on all of these intervals. So how many of these eruptions are in here? That's the big question. That's how we can start teasing out if our chances are going up or down. And for you fellow math nerds, here are some of the equations I've used. Basically, we're taking the number of intervals between now and an hour from now and dividing it by all the intervals that are greater than now. And this is the equation that I used in Excel. I rearranged it a little bit to make it more easy. I'm not going to go through this right now. A recording of this will be available later, so if you want to go through and do these your equations yourself, this will be there. Okay, so we're going to take these equations and apply it to every time point along this x-axis here. And we're going to get a graph that looks like this. So on the x-axis here, you have your current interval. This is how long it's been since the last eruption. And on the y-axis here, you have percent chance of erupting in the next 15 minutes. Now, I chose 15 minutes here because it worked well for Artemisia. You could also choose percent chance of erupting in the next hour, in the next 3 minutes. It really depends on the geyser. And as you can see, your chances keep going up. So the longer you wait for Artemisia, the better the chances you're going to get for it. So all those people who show up after 25, 26 hours, they might be onto something. Because your chances really start going up around 15, 20 hours, up to 25 hours. And okay, what's going on with the graph here? The short answer is we don't have as much data on Artemisia for intervals that get this large. I mean, especially once you get past 30 hours, you're almost in uncharted territory. And that brings me to one of the first limitations of this algorithm is that you need a lot of data. You can't crunch the numbers on just a few intervals. You need hundreds, if not thousands, even better if you have tens of thousands of intervals that you can crunch the numbers with. Which means that long-term electronic monitoring is almost required for this. And if this presentation is not enough to convince you that we need to do more long-term electronic monitoring, then I would encourage you to log in 2 weeks from now for my colleague Mara Reed's presentation of basically the same thing. She'll be discussing the benefits of long-term electronic monitoring. Back to this, another limitation is that the data needs to be well curated. In that double intervals, if you have double intervals in your data, it'll throw up the shape of the graph immensely. Let's again look at Artemisia. Let's take all of the intervals of Artemisia that we have in geyser times, whether electronic, visual, historical, whatever, and plot them in the same graph. Ugh, that doesn't really look too good. It means that after 20, 25 hours, your chances actually start going down. Well, this doesn't really agree with what we saw earlier. And what we saw earlier was strictly from electronic data. And I can tell you why that is. Here's a histogram of all of the intervals of Artemisia that are on geyser times. And look at this big boy here. These are all the intervals that are greater than 72 hours. These are all of the double intervals. These are all of the triple intervals. These are all of the intervals where there are gaps in the electronic records. This is when Artemisia went into the nighttime and the webcam didn't see it for a few days. and they really start throwing off the graph at the end. So the simple solution is, okay, let's cut them all off. Let's say we take all of the eruptions over 60 hours. Well, that's making the graph a little bit different. What if we cut off the intervals at 60 hours, 48 hours? That's looking better. 40 hours? That's looking pretty good. What if we cut it off at even 34 hours? Oh, that means that our chances are going way up at 30 hours. But okay, let's put on the brakes here. When you're curating the data, you need to start asking yourself, which are the double intervals? For Artemisia, there are some double intervals that are shorter than single intervals, so you can't put a hard line there. So like, where are you going to put off this cutoff? You don't know. And as we saw, the shape of the graph depends heavily on how the data is curated, and that is a huge source of putting in bias. So much so that, except for the rare case, I don't even touch it. And that's why for almost every geyser that we're going to look at today, it's strictly from electronic data sets. And I would encourage anybody who tries to look at geysers this way to be very conscious of how they're curating their data set. And because we're using a lot of electronic data sets, some of the temperature sensors aren't logging every minute, which means you can get some weird results if you don't set your interval to the right time. So for instance, this logger was set to sample every 3 minutes. But if we look at the percent chance of erupting every 7 minutes, it's going to start sawtoothing. We need to look at it either every 3 minutes or every 6 minutes. And lastly, a couple more points. These graphs have no context as to what's happening at the geyser and around the geyser that could affect its chances of erupting. So, for example, Great Fountain is not an overflow yet. There's basically no chance that it's going to erupt within the next 30 minutes, even if you crunch the numbers and the graph tells you otherwise. And second, and lastly, the geyser should have a stable activity throughout the data's time span. Otherwise, the graph just isn't going to make sense. So, with all those in mind, let's jump in and see what kind of trends we can see for the geysers that we have nice electronic data sets for. Starting off with actually one geyser that's just out of frame here, Lion. And so for Lion, the electronic data set in geyser times is well curated enough that I could split it up the data between intervals following initial eruptions and intervals following all the other eruptions. And as you can see, we get this nice spike up when it comes time for the next eruption of the series, after which our chances plummet. The series is over. And then the chances for the next initial start slowly creeping up. They don't get that high, and it almost doesn't seem like they keep increasing either. If you're wondering why the post-initial graph is a lot jumpier, it's because we don't have as much data on when Lion has an initial and then ends the series right afterwards. We can also take a closer look at the first couple hours of this graph to see that after initial, you have to wait for a little bit longer for your chances to go up than after all the other eruptions. Also notice this little hump right here. Those are the minor intervals following the minor eruptions. On the other side of the platform, see them right there, is Little Cub. Now, this is an interesting shape, but those of you familiar with watching Little Cub might not be surprised. So it seems like our chances go way up around 50 minutes and then immediately go way back down. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if it misses this sweet spot here, it's not as likely to erupt. And we have a very scientific for this. It gets stuck. And we can see this. If it misses that opportunity to erupt, it'll sit there and splash and glorp and make funny noises for who knows how long. If you're waiting for Little Cub and you get to this point, maybe walk away. You can actually see the same shape at Logbridge Geyser, which is in the Lower Geyser Basin on the Firehole Lake Drive. You get this sweet spot of eruptions, but if it doesn't take the chance, your chances start going down, and then they flatline out at a lower chance until the geyser finally erupts. Going on down further on Firehole Lake Drive, we have Pink Cone. So there is some electronic data on Pink Cone. The graph is kind of jumpy because there isn't as much as on other geysers. But for Pink Cone, it seems like your chances just keep going up and exponentially so. So if it hasn't erupted in 26 hours, get over there. You're probably going to get lucky and see it soon. One thing I found interesting were these hourly spikes, and I don't know if that's real or if it's some artifact of the data. Maybe it's something that we want to pay attention to the geyser to. Maybe these surges out of the geyser coincide with these. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just an artifact of being electronic data, so I was actually able to compile both the visual and electronic data we have for ping cone and geyser times. And this is because for ping cone, because it has a very clear cutoff between single and double intervals. And those hourly spikes are still there. They're not as pronounced though, but we still get the same shape of the graph where your chances just keep going up, up, up. Right behind pink cone, pink actually has a good electronic data set. If you look at its history, it seems to have two modes of activity, one before 2008, where you have to wait for about 4 hours for your chances to go up, but they stay pretty high. And then after 2010, from 2010 to 2017, you get your chances earlier on pink, but it has that sweet spot again, and it comes down. It doesn't crash down like Little Cub or Log Bridge, but it comes down and stays pretty stable after that. And one thing to keep in mind here is that geysers do change their activity. So the data that I might present here might be from a different era of its eruptive behaviors, and it might be behaving differently now. I'll try to mention that whenever we get to those geysers. Behind pink, if you can look through that gap in the trees, you'll see Narcissus, which we know to have major eruptions and minor eruptions. The minor eruptions happen after shorter intervals, and the major eruptions happen after longer intervals. And I just find it interesting how, if we look at the histogram, the minor eruptions have this big tall spike here, whereas the major eruptions have this lower, broader spike here. But if we look at the percent chance of erupting in the next 6 minutes, this graph here, we can see that the minor eruptions have this little hump here, and then your chances of a major go up, up, and then flatline around 4.5 hours. And that's because if you're coming up to the point where a minor eruption could occur, you're not sure if it's going to be a minor or not be a major, if you don't know what the previous eruption was, that is. So your chances are pretty low. Once you get to this point, though, you're pretty sure you're going to come to a major, so your chances start going up even higher. Another geyser that has a very clear cutoff between single and double intervals is Lone Star. So there is not actually any available electronic data for Lone Star on geyser times, but it has been watched for many decades and is a very reliable performer. So I was able to crunch the numbers on this one and see some interesting data. So if you're waiting at Lone Star, your chances of getting a major, if you know the time of the last major, start going up a little bit before 2.5, but they don't start getting that high until you get closer to 3 hours. So maybe this lower range here is the chance that a minor eruption will trigger the major. But then once you get up to 3 hours, that's when your chances go up. So you get to about 30% chance in any given 5 minutes. Those are pretty good odds. Don't walk away from Lone Star if you get to that far in the interval. Let's head back to the Upper Geyser Basin and look at Oblong. This one might surprise some of you. We've seen this shape a few times before. With Oblong, your chances start going up around 3 hours. Now keep in mind, this is data from 1997 to 2016, after which it went into a dormancy and it's still struggling to come out of that. But during this time period, your chances are really starting to come up around 4 hours, 5 hours, but if it hasn't erupted by 6 hours, your chances start going down. And especially by 8 hours, you might think maybe it's time to walk away from oblong. For those who are curious, this is actually the second of the set of 3 histograms that I showed earlier. Oblong, indeed, your chances go down the longer you wait. Let's look at grand. And here I again split up the data from pre-2012 and post-2012 because if anybody remembers, it started erupting every 5 to 6 hours in 2012, and then it's lengthened out again, but it hasn't reached the same sort of activity since pre-2012. When your chances would kind of go up around 6-7 hours, flatline, maybe even go down a little bit, and gradually start increasing. So all those gazers who were second half of the window gazing, maybe there was something to that because your chances were starting to go up only once you got into that second half of the window. After 2012, in its current phase, we see a little bit of that same shape, except our chances go up earlier and they go up higher. We still get that kind of 1 to 2 hours of flatline where once you get to about maybe 6.25 hours, your chances don't increase until we start getting past 8 hours. And then they really start going up. So I found that really interesting. Relevant to grand is Rift Geyser, which I thought was interesting that it has almost the same shape as grand, but the hours don't line up between the two. So that is maybe a coincidence, maybe not. Hard to tell. But as you can see, you have a small chance of getting a short interval, an increase where you could get this 8 to 12 hour interval. Once you got past 12 hours, your chances went way up. Let's look at another one of the predictable geysers, Riverside. So we know Riverside to be bimodal. And between this time period, 2005, 2014, it almost seemed more of a toss-up if it was going to take the short interval or the long interval. So you might be wondering, why does the short interval here, the hump for the chance of the short interval, why is it so much lower than this hump for the long interval? And that's because as you're waiting for Riverside and you're coming up to the chance for it to have a short, you don't know if it's going to be a short or long. So your chances aren't really there yet. Once you get to this point and you're waiting for the long, you know it's going to be a long and your chances go up. One thing that I love about this graph is just how high your chances get. So this is a percent chance of erupting in the next 3 minutes, and you get up to 60% chance. Spoiler alert, not even Old Faithful gets this high. If you get this far in Riverside's interval, it's gonna erupt. And another way you could see that is you run out of data very quickly. The graph becomes very jumpy very quickly. Also interesting, down here, you can see the little hump of the super short interval. One thing about Riverside is that its intervals do tend to slide over the years, and this is about a decade's worth of data. If you do take a narrower time point, you can see that between the short and the long, your chances almost reach back down to zero. Let's move on to Pyramid, where there is a good set of electronic data for Pyramid. Around 2.5, 3 hours, your chances go up, up, up. Afterwards, they fall a little bit, but not too much. So even if you've missed your sweet spot on Pyramid, maybe still wait for it because you still got about a 30% chance of it erupting in the next 6 minutes. That's pretty good. Another geyser that we have a lot of data for is Spouter. And by the way, if you haven't watched Spouter start an eruption, I would encourage you to do that because it's really fun. But here we see that the graph kind of meanders about, but steadily increases until you get to 8 hours and then it skyrockets. And some of you might be saying, now wait a minute. The interval of Spouter depends on the previous eruption's duration. Well, the data set in geyser times has the duration, so I was able to split it up. After a shorter eruption of 40 to 80 minutes, your chances go up early and they go up quick. After some medium length eruptions of 80 to 120 minutes, your chances go up a little bit later, but they still rise pretty steadily. If Spouter has a very long eruption of over 2 hours duration, you're going to have to wait until about 4 hours for your chances to go up, and they steadily climb after that. we have no shortage of data on Old Faithful. So this is about over a period of 22 years here. And shorts in the past couple decades have not been that common for Old Faithful, so you can see the hump for them is pretty low here. And afterwards, your chances just go up. And like Riverside, you run out of data very quickly. You get to about a 25% chance of Old Faithful erupting in the next minute once you start reaching 110, 120 minutes. Old Faithful is another one of those rare geysers where the double interval and the single interval are pretty clear cut from each other. So I was able to take all the visual and electronic data, put them into what happens at Old Faithful after a short eruption. Well, your chances go up earlier than the long. No surprises there. It is interesting to see that these graphs almost have the same shape, though. From here on out, the geysers that we're going to look at come with a caveat. So, like with Lone Pine here, there isn't as much electronic data on it. That's why the graph is so erratic and jumpy. But we can see that it does seem to have that sweet spot again of around maybe 25 hours between eruptions. And this is for its activity between 2002 and 2011. After that sweet spot, it seems to get stuck and your chances are going down a little bit. Another graph that you need to take with a grain of salt is Castle's here. Because again, it seems like we have this sweet spot of the major eruption after which your chances go down. I think what this graph is telling us here is that if you get to this point in the interval, you're probably waiting after a minor eruption, which you would know by looking at Castle. One thing that I find very interesting about this graph is this cleft peak here. I tried to cut the data. I thought, okay, maybe in the first half of this range between 1997 and 2016, it was erupting here at 14 hours, and then in the second half, it was erupting at 15. But no matter how I cut the data, I was still getting this cleft. I don't know if it's real. I don't know if it's an artifact of the data. Maybe it's something that we can look out for, see if there's this almost bimodal trend for Castle as well. Beehive. Beehive is one where it seems like every time it comes out of winter and we get into summer, it's acting a little bit differently. So take this graph with a grain of salt because it's covering the years between 2003 and 2017. But we can still see that there's some very familiar trends here. Like your chances start going up around 8 hours. Those are about the shortest known beehive intervals. And they come up to around maybe 12 to 14 hours. Historically, it's like that point. Afterwards, you go down, and then you come back up to the 24-hour time point. Historically, beehive has liked about 24-hour intervals. And if it hasn't erupted by then, your chances go down. So does that mean that once you get to 30 hours post beehive, you should walk away? I think in this case, the better idea is to look at geyser times and see if it's been having 30-hour intervals or not recently. Gray Fountain is an interesting graph. Kind of like Grand, it comes up and then plateaus before finally taking off. But like I said earlier, if you're at Great Fountain and it's been 13 hours since the last eruption and it's not at overflow, your chances of it erupting in the next 20 minutes are not 20%, they're zero. So you could almost look at this graph, subtract about an hour to an hour and a half off of these numbers down here for the current interval and make this a graph of it percent chance of it reaching overflow in the next 20 minutes. And then I'm going to throw this in almost as a warning that this graph is not applicable to all geysers because it really just doesn't make sense with Grotto. All right, so current interval, let's take this time point right here, 10 hours. It says that your percent chance of it erupting in the next 30 minutes are around 5%. Well, you could be looking at Grotto and it might still be erupting from the previous eruption, and you can just get so much more information by looking at the geyser than this graph here. some of you have been watching closely might be wondering, okay, what happened to that third histogram that we saw in that set of three early on? Well, I've saved it for the last, and it is indeed Orem Geyser. As some of you well know, Orem displays different activities in the winter and in the summer. In the winter, it's short and regular. In the summer, it's long and erratic. So what I did is I took the data between 1997 and 2014, and I only chose those stretches of data where it was exhibiting summer mode, and I crunched the numbers. And for Orem, if it's the summer and you're between 1997 and 2014, your chances would go up around 3 hours, start slowing down around 4 or 5 hours, and then plateau off about 8 hours. So you'd get an 8 to 10% chance of it erupting in any given 15 minutes, and that goes neither up nor down. And there is that histogram that you saw earlier in the presentation. Now, keep in mind that after 2014, Orem saw a decline in activity, leading to dormancy, which it recently came out of. But before that, Orem was the slot machine of geysers. So if any of you like going to the casino and putting a nickel into the slot machine, pulling the lever, you didn't win, well, your chances of winning the next time aren't higher or lower. So you put in another nickel and pull the lever, and you put in another nickel and pull the lever, and you put in another 5 minutes at Orem, and you wait, and you put in another 5 minutes at Orem, and you wait, and it's the same thing. So if you've gotten to 12 hours at Orem, 14 hours at Orem, and 16 hours at Orem, and it hasn't erupted, when do you walk away? It's maybe when you hear splashing in Maine called over the radio. And with that, I would like to open up to any questions. So the question is, do most geysers have intervals that follow a normal distribution, or are they generally skewed in a certain way? I think to answer that question, we have to look back at some of the trends that we saw, how some geysers, their chances keep going up, and some geysers, their chances keep going down. So that's going to skew the data one way or another. So you don't have a certain set, like most geysers are going to be skewed one way, because we see that their chances of erupting later in the interval can go up or down, so they can be skewed one way or another. I hope that answers your question. Another question for Grotto, would there be a way to correct for duration? I think that would be a neat graph. You absolutely could. If you had enough intervals with the preceding eruption's duration, you could split that up, and I think that would make a great graph. So something similar like I did with Spouter. The question is, you just need a very well curated data set. Another question, how, if at all, would you say this applies to some of the rarer geysers given that they are in an active phase? So it's really hard to use this algorithm, to use this visualization of the data for rare geysers, because you could try to put them to the algorithm, but your graph would just look like this. There's just not enough data to say, as you're going on later, your chances go up or your chances are going down. And maybe if the graph has some shape, maybe you can take a guess. But to really say definitively, okay, your chances are going up or your chances are going down, I would say you need a lot more data. But we can take what we've seen and push this forward and say not all geysers will keep improving as their interval goes on. Not all, or even not all geysers will improve or disimprove. Some of them may just reach a steady state, like Orem. Now it's our job to observe the rare geyser and make guesses. Do we have a better chance of seeing giant tomorrow or a worse chance? So there's another question. Would there be enough data to see if the odds of a geyser coming out of a dormancy is going up or down over time? I think, again, the issue with that is not nearly enough data. How many dormancies of any geyser do we have on record? Probably a handful at best. Also, for definitely a good chunk of geysers, them coming out of dormancy seems to be correlated with some other event, maybe an eruption of another nearby geyser, your spring, for example, or an earthquake, where so it's not just a percent chance that might go up and down over time. Some geysers might be waiting for an event to trigger them. So another question is, do you have thoughts about how to apply this to geysers with periodic pre-eruptive behavior, like for Grand? Both the time from the last Grand and the last turbine matters. So I'm going to go back to Grand actually, because I did something specific about this graph, and I made it the percent chance of erupting in the next 20 minutes, specifically 20 minutes, because turbine erupts about every 20 minutes. So you could think of this graph as the percent chance of Grand erupting on the next turbine. But yeah, geysers that do exhibit pre-eruptive periodic behavior, that's going to tell you a lot more about its chances of erupting than any of these graphs. You can use like a combination of the graph and what you're seeing, what you're visually observing to get a better idea. And I think that is all the questions we have today. I will want to thank you all for watching, and I will hand it back over to Will.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh wait, we'll slide in one more question.
Okay. So thinking about the spikes on pink cone graph, do you think this could be put into our toolbox for inferring energy cycles or things like that? I think it's something to look out for because we know that geysers go through periods. I mean, we have 20-minute cycle on turbine for Grand, or we have the push cycles on oblong, the push cycles on depression. The one part that makes me hesitant about pink cone is the fact that those spikes are so concise, even at 20 hours after the last eruption, which means if there are energy cycles happening at pink cone, they're extremely regular for them to be seen 20 cycles out on a graph. Another one that kind of has a little bit of those cycles is Spouter. Even after we split up the data by duration, you can see that we still get this up, down, up, down, up, down on all three of these graphs. So we might be able to infer that there's some sort of energy cycle happening below Spouter as well. Yeah,
Okay.
there's a comment
Wait.
that says perhaps that is when the cycles start at a consistent time frame after the last eruption. It's quite possible.
Okay. Well, I think that will conclude our for our presentation today. Uh,
Thank you
next
all.
next week, we have Suzanne and Heinrich. They our first one for international. They are gonna talk about geysers in New Zealand. So tune in next week to see all about their travels abroad and how geysers are abroad. Have a good evening, everyone.